Hey everyone, back again for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at some pretty strong opinions about crime and government efficiency. Actually, let me back up for a sec. These sources today, they did not hold back. Okay, we've got one piece questioning if Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg focusing so much on convicting Trump was the right move, especially with crime rates being what they are. And then we've got another piece suggesting that Vivek Ramaswamy's back to the office mandate for federal employees could be like this genius way to streamline government. Maybe a little controversial too, though. Haha. So ready to unpack all this.
Sounds like a fascinating snapshot of the current political climate. Both sources are raising some really interesting questions about how our leaders are approaching these challenges.
Right. Okay, so first up, let's talk about Bragg. This article just comes right out and asks if going after Trump actually made New York less safe.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they frame this whole thing in the context of what they call progressive prosecution policies that DAs like Bragg have been advocating for. The idea is basically that they can focus their limited resources on the most serious crimes. But this author is pushing back a bit, saying, hey, wait a minute, spending all this time and money on Trump, doesn't that kind of go against that whole idea?
Exactly. And they're not just theorizing that. They point out that Bragg's office spent $1 million on outside counsel just to deal with congressional inquiries about the Trump case. $1 million. Not to mention the estimated security costs during the trial, which were like 50 grand per day.
Yeah.
I mean, you could do a lot with that kind of money.
Absolutely. And the article goes on to highlight how dismissal rates for assault cases in Manhattan actually went up during Bragg's time in office. It really makes you wonder if those resources could have been better used to address more immediate public safety concerns.
For sure. And they bring up this really heartbreaking example too, a deadly stabbing spree in Manhattan where the perpetrator had this long rap sheet. It makes you think, could Bragg's office have done more to prevent this? What's their responsibility in stopping these kinds of violent crimes?
It's a really tough question, and the author doesn't shy away from implying that maybe Bragg's focus on Trump was more about politics than public safety. It's a provocative argument, for sure, and it raises some important questions about how prosecutorial decisions are made.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about Ramaswamy and this whole back to the office thing. So his proposal is that all federal employees have to come back to the office full time. And his reasoning is pretty interesting.
Right. His main focus is on government efficiency. He basically thinks that making everyone come back to the office will help cut down on what he calls bureaucratic bloat. You know, all those inefficiencies and unnecessary layers that tend to build up in government.
And he's not talking about small savings either. He claims that if 550,000 federal employees quit because of this mandate, it could save the government something like $27.5 billion a year. That's a serious chunk of change.
Yeah, but the article also points out that there could be some downsides to this plan. I mean, think about it. Replacing that many experienced employees would be incredibly expensive, not to mention all the institutional knowledge that would be lost. And while those new employees are getting up to speed, there's a real risk that essential government services could be disrupted.
Good point. And haven't we learned something about the effectiveness of remote work over the past few years? The article mentions that the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, actually found that flexible work arrangements can be more efficient in many cases, especially for roles that don't require you to be physically present in an office.
Exactly. So maybe a blanket return to office mandate isn't the best solution. The author seems to think that a more targeted approach might be better, like focusing on modernizing systems and using technology to improve efficiency, and maybe even expanding remote work options where it makes sense.
Yeah, I see where they're coming from. You can't just slash the workforce and expect everything to magically work better.
Yeah.
So we've got these two really different opinions here, both with some pretty big implications. On one hand, you've got this question of whether a DA like Bragg is putting his personal political goals ahead of public safety.
And on the other, you've got this debate about how to make the government more efficient and whether forcing everyone back to the office is really the answer. Both sources are getting at some fundamental questions about how we want our government to work and who it should be working for.
Definitely. So what do you think about all this? We'll be back in a flash to keep unpacking these ideas, but in the meantime, take a second and let these contrasting opinions really sink in. What stands out to you? What's making you go, I need to think about that some more. We'll be right back.
It's interesting how both of these sources, even though they're talking about totally different things, are both struggling with this idea of limited resources. Like with Bragg, it's about balancing these high-profile cases against the day-to-day realities of crime in the city.
Yeah, and with Ramaswamy, it's like, okay, maybe you could save money by shrinking the government, but what's the cost of losing all that experience and potentially messing up essential services? It's tough.
Totally. And that's where critical thinking comes in, right? It's not about picking a side. It's about really digging into the arguments, looking at the evidence, and thinking through what each path might actually lead to.
Okay, so let's go back to that first article for a second. The author spends a lot of time talking about how Bragg keeps saying these progressive prosecution policies are all about using resources more wisely. But then they turn around and ask if those policies are actually being applied fairly in practice.
It's almost like they're suggesting that these policies, which are supposed to be about reducing mass incarceration and making the system fairer, might actually be backfiring in some cases.
Whoa, that's a bold statement. Are they saying these policies could actually be making things worse?
Well, they definitely seem skeptical. They even question whether these policies are really about discretion, like their supporters claim, or if they're more about pushing a certain ideology and they bring up those rising dismissal rates for assault cases again. Like maybe that's a sign that something's not quite right.
Okay, so that's definitely a hot button issue, and I know people feel strongly on both sides. But remember, we're not here to tell you what to think. We're just laying out the information so you can make up your own mind.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to hear different perspectives, even the ones that make us uncomfortable. It's the only way to really understand these complicated issues.
All right, let's swing back over to Ramaswamy's back to the office idea. One thing that really jumped out at me was how the author suggests that maybe this whole mandate thing isn't the most effective way to save money and make the government run better.
Yeah, they have some serious concerns about shaking things up that drastically. They're worried that the cost savings might not be as big as Ramaswamy thinks, and that losing all those experienced workers could actually end up costing more in the long run.
And they keep bringing up how remote work has actually been pretty successful in a lot of government agencies, especially since the pandemic. Remember that OMB report? Seems like flexible work arrangements can actually make things more efficient, at least in some cases.
Right, which kind of throws a wrench in the whole everyone back to the office plan. The author seems to be pushing for a more targeted approach, like finding ways to use technology better and streamlining processes instead of just cutting people.
It makes sense to me. It's not like you can just wave a magic wand to make the government run perfectly just by getting rid of a bunch of workers. There's got to be a smarter way to do it.
Absolutely. And they also bring up this really interesting point about the impact on industries that rely on the federal government for oversight. Like what happens if there are suddenly huge delays in permits, inspections, all that stuff. Could end up costing businesses and state governments a ton of money in the long run.
Oh, good catch. Didn't think about that. So, big picture, we've got these two really different takes on how to tackle some pretty major challenges. On one side, we've got this question about whether progressive prosecution is actually living up to its promises, and whether it might even be making things worse in some ways.
And on the other side, you've got this debate about how to make the government more efficient without causing a ton of disruption and potentially making things worse in the process.
So much to think about. We'll be back in a jiffy to dive even deeper into these sources, but before we do, what's grabbing your attention? What are you finding most surprising or thought-provoking about these contrasting opinions? Hang tight, we'll be right back.
You know, one thing that keeps coming up for me as we go through these opinions is this tension between individual rights and what's best for the collective good. Seems like it's everywhere.
Totally. Like with Bragg and the Trump case, it's about balancing the right to a fair trial and due process with the need to keep people safe right now.
And with Ramaswamy's back to the office idea, it's like the right of those federal employees to work from home versus this idea that everyone being in the office is somehow better for the government and for taxpayers. Classic dilemma. No wonder it gets people so riled up.
It's true. Okay, but that's exactly why we got to take a step back and look at the arguments themselves. What's the evidence? What are the assumptions? And what could happen, good or bad, if we actually do what they're suggesting?
Couldn't agree more. Critical thinking isn't about picking a side, it's about thinking for yourself.
Yeah.
Don't just believe something because it sounds nice or because someone you like said it. Look at all sides, weigh the evidence, then decide.
All right, let's circle back to that first article about Bragg for a minute. They spend a lot of time on this concept of recidivism. You know, people committing crimes over and over, especially with that awful stabbing case in Manhattan. The author really seems to think that Bragg's policies, or maybe this whole progressive prosecution movement in general, might be leading to more repeat offenders.
Well, recidivism is a complicated issue. Criminologists have been studying it forever, and there just isn't a simple answer. There are so many factors involved, like the person's background, the economy, whether they get support to turn their life around.
So we can't just point the finger at one policy or one DA, right? But this article is raising some important questions. Like, are we really doing enough to prevent people, especially violent criminals, from committing more crimes?
It's a huge concern for sure. How do we balance giving people second chances with keeping everyone safe? It's a tough balancing act, and we need to find smart solutions, not just quick fixes.
Okay, let's go back to Ramaswamy and the whole back to the office debate. The author had this interesting idea. What if, instead of just shrinking the workforce, we focused on making government better?
Yeah, they're saying don't assume that fewer people automatically equals more efficiency. Find the actual waste, the inefficient processes, and fix those.
Exactly. And they're worried about losing so much experience if a ton of government workers quit. Plus, all those essential services that could be disrupted while they're scrambling to train new people, it makes you think about the long-term impact, not just the immediate effects.
Absolutely. Every decision has ripple effects. We need to be having these conversations, hearing all the different perspectives, and really thinking through the consequences before making any big changes.
Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are your takeaways? What surprised you? What new questions do you have? These opinions we've been exploring, they might seem different at first glance, but they both get at some fundamental questions. Questions about what government should be doing, how it should be using our money, and how we balance individual rights with the needs of society as a whole.
Really important questions. And in a world where things are changing so quickly and everyone's got an opinion, it's more important than ever to think critically and challenge our own assumptions. Don't just accept what you hear, dig deeper, ask questions, and form your own informed opinions.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, helping you go beyond the headlines and really understand the issues that matter. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those critical thinking caps on.